talking about Euthyphro, the first thing we're going to I've already assigned you to read. So let me talk first about Socrates in a couple of ways. Socrates is sort of the star of the show here in this particular book. And yet the book's not written by Socrates, it's written by Plato. So before I start talking sort of in more detail about what we need to know about Socrates' philosophy, maybe a little bit of the relationship between Plato and Socrates is worth talking about. And the way I'm going to do that is to talk about the sources of information we have from history about Socrates. How do we know about Socrates? We know about him, well, we don't know about him through his writings that he didn't do any writing. But other people wrote about him, and he was so prominent in his time that we have a fairly good, wide-ranging set of records about who Socrates was, what he thought, and different things like that. The interesting thing is we can divide these sources of information about Socrates into three general groups. Those who liked the guy, those who hated the guy, and those who are sort of objective about the guy. And so we'll do it that way, and you'll get a sense of who liked him and who was his enemy and other things like that. And that's the way we approach Plato, because Plato was his adoring student. Plato thought he was the greatest person who ever lived. Many people think Plato is right about that. Plato was a student, maybe 30 years younger, 25 years younger than Socrates, came from a very rich family. Now Socrates didn't. He came from a family sort of working class, well maybe a little bit above that. His father had a good job, had a good sort of a profession, sort of was a stonecutter, and sort of tried to apparently dabbled a little bit in sculpture as well. So there was a little bit of, not a lot of money, but there's a little bit of money in the family, just sort of a middle class kind of a person. But Plato was filthy rich, and his whole family was filthy rich. And Plato didn't have to do anything but follow Socrates around, and he did. He started when he was a young man, following Socrates around, learning philosophy, and just being sort of almost worshiping the guy. After Socrates dies, Plato is his best known pupil, and he had been his pupil for decades. He was his best known pupil and began to be a philosopher on his own right, and began to do a lot of writing about philosophical things. But nearly all of his writings, all of Plato's writings, have Socrates as a main character in this little miniature play. And some of them are not miniature, some of them are big. But these are called dialogues. Dia doesn't mean only two people. It sort of means, you know, among people. So talking among people. And some of the dialogues, like the Republic, has 7 or 8 or 9 characters. And so it's not always two people. The way it works out, and the ones we're going to read, is 2 people. But other dialogues have more than 2 people. But in almost all cases, Plato wrote dialogues in which the main character was Socrates. So we get to know something about Socrates through the writings of Plato. But something strange happens to Plato over the years. After he leaves the influence of his teacher, because his teacher dies, he starts evolving as a philosopher and starts leaving behind merely being a mimic or a copycat of what Socrates thought. And a little more, by a little more, it becomes more sophisticated and much more complex as a philosopher on his own right. But he still keeps using, even though he's now essentially presenting his own thoughts and not just repeating the thoughts of Socrates. Now, in his later dialogues, he still uses Socrates as sort of a mouthpiece, as the central character in these dialogues. But what Socrates is saying in these later dialogues is a lot different from what Socrates is saying in the early dialogues. And the reason is that we have this consistent character, Socrates, going through. But the early dialogues, and the 3 that you're going to read, are part of the early dialogues that really attempt to depict Socrates as he would have talked, as he did talk. And later on, as Plato gets his own philosophical legs, Socrates is still there talking about stuff that suddenly sounds real Platonic and not so much Socratic. And that's the way it works. So we have to ask, where are we going to sort of draw a line and say, this stuff and before is a good depiction of Socrates, the philosopher, the person, the character. And by the character, I don't mean weirdo. I mean a person of character, a person of integrity, which I think a lot of people think he was. And where do we get the picture becoming more of almost an idealized, almost projecting himself onto the character of Socrates into the middle and the late dialogues, so that it becomes more Plato speaking through the words of Socrates. Whereas in the beginning, the early dialogues, it's Socrates more or less speaking for himself with the aid of the literary merit of Plato. Plato loved Socrates, probably not physically, but there was a little of that going on in Athens at the time. Plato did love and revere and honor and worship his teacher, and initially tried to create dialogues that would keep his teacher's memory alive, keep the memory not just of how nice a guy he was, but what he thought, how he talked to people, what his role in Athens was, and what his philosophical ideas were. So that's one source that we have of the ideas of Socrates, and they come down certainly embellished to a certain extent. When we think about the first dialogue, in fact, if we look at the three dialogues we're going to look at, we see three different ways in which we can understand them. The first one, Euthyphro, depicts a conversation between Euthyphro, a young man who is sort of a pretty self-righteous religious official of some sort, and Socrates. And they meet at the courthouse steps. And they meet about a week before the trial that will be the next thing we read, the trial that Socrates has to undergo. And so they have this conversation about the nature of piety, because both of them have a vested interest in some sort of, let's say, a religious stamp of approval on actions they have done. For Socrates, he's being charged with not being pious, not having the right religious beliefs. For Euthyphro, you're going to find that he is prosecuting his father, which itself is thought to be impious, for something the father did. And so they both meet on the courthouse steps, and they start talking just generally, but little by little they start talking about their own trials. And Socrates gets the idea that maybe we can continue this conversation a little longer, because maybe we can both learn something about the nature of piety, because we both seem to have very different ideas of what it is. So the question maybe we could ask is, did this conversation ever take place? Likely it did not, exactly the way it is written there. But maybe a better question to ask is, well, if it never didn't take place, why did Plato write it? Plato probably wrote it because he had been with his teacher for, like I said, 20 to 30 years. He had heard probably every day of Socrates, of their lives, heard him talk to different people about different things. He had certainly heard Socrates talk about the nature of piety. It would be the kind of thing that would have interested Socrates, and he would have found enough people of a religious mind to start talking with him about it. So probably a conversation like this occurred at some time in Socrates' life. Maybe it was with Euthyphro. Maybe this is almost like a composite of several people that talked with Socrates about that. And Plato was just trying to sort of show what it would have been like if you were conversing with Socrates about the nature of reverence, about the nature of piety. What would the conversation have been like if you had been someone who was sort of young and pretty brash, and you think you know what you're talking about, you know you're saved, and you're going to go to heaven, so that's okay, you got everything nailed. What would it be like to talk to this person who's really going to ask you some uncomfortable questions? So I would say, first of all, the conversation is probably not a transcript of anything that happened, but it's probably pretty close to what happened several times, and Plato just sort of made a literary device of saying, we'll make Euthyphro stand for all of these people that Socrates talked to about the topic at one time or another. So that's what I think we can best understand Euthyphro back when to be. The next one thing we read is called Apology, and it is thought to be something close to the defense account that he gives in his trial. The trial would be two parts. First, the prosecution presents its case, and then the defense presents its case. Plato was there at the trial. He makes it pretty clear that he was, and there's good reason to believe that that's correct. So that he was there and heard everything that went on, and apparently wrote this not long after the trial. Particularly the way the trial turned out, he felt it was very important to get some sort of a record of what happened, because he was shocked at the way the trial turned out. He felt a great injustice was being done, and he probably wanted more than anything to keep a record of, this is what you did to my teacher, this is what you did to this great man, the greatest man Athens has ever known, and he probably wanted to have that there as a way of saying, you can't escape what you've done. You can't escape the facts of, this is who you are and this is what you did. So there's a good reason to think that this is probably pretty close to, if not a transcript, very, very close to what Socrates himself said, the way the conversation went. There's another reason to think that, and I'll bring that up in a minute. Let's next go to Crito, the last thing you'll read, the third thing you'll read. This purports to take place as a conversation between Socrates and his dear lifelong friend Crito in his jail cell before the execution. And the question is, did this ever happen? And I think it's likely, certainly, people probably came to visit Socrates. Now, the subject matter, at least that begins this third dialogue, the subject matter of this third dialogue is Socrates, why don't we help you escape? And it's likely because in those days, either rich people or people with rich friends could buy their way out of anything. I mean, you have to go on exile, you have to live out of the country forever. But there are a lot of people willing to take a lot of bribes from a lot of rich people with plenty of money to get you out of jail, get you anywhere you want to. In fact, one of the reasons, when we look at the trial, one of the reasons often given for why important trials had such large juries, Socrates' trials had about 501 people, why large trials had or why important trials had such large juries is that bribery was so common that they had to have a big enough pool of people that you couldn't bribe them all. So you might have almost a fair trial. So we'll see about that. So is it possible that Crito, his wealthy and dear friend, came to visit Socrates? Yeah, probably. Is it probable, or is it even possible, that they had gathered some money together and were willing to spring him? Yeah, it was a common thing. It was not unusual. So this last one has a certain amount of credibility to it. If we put them on a scale of credibility, apology is at the top, Crito is second, Euthyphro is third, but all of them do depict in a fairly accurate way, this book, Socrates and the kind of person he was. But this is from Plato, a person who wants to have his teacher look good. So the question is, are there other voices to be heard about this person, Socrates? Because when you read stuff by Plato, Socrates always wins the arguments. Socrates always is gentle and kind. Socrates has a wonderful sense of humor. Socrates. What a guy. Maybe there are people that didn't like Socrates. Maybe there are people that really got pissed off at Socrates. Is there any record of that? Why, yes, there is. There is a famous man in Athens, contemporary of Socrates, who hated him. And not only was he famous, he was a writer. And so he left a legacy of sarcasm about Socrates. He was a playwright. His name is Aristophanes. Aristophanes was one of the four great playwrights of ancient Greece. I was in theater for a long time. I studied theater. I was an actor. So you sort of read as many plays as you can. I've read a lot of plays. I've acted in a lot of plays. And have been in Greek plays as well, in translations, of course. And certainly Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, and I think Aristophanes are the four greatest of the playwrights of ancient Greece. What made Aristophanes different? And he's the one we're talking about who hated Socrates. What made him different from the other ones, at least in a literary way, is that he wrote comedies. He wrote comedies in the way that always has an undercurrent of serious topics underneath it. If you think of someone like Jon Stewart today on television, Jon Stewart will make you laugh, but he always wants to make you think. He always has a point to make underneath it. Well, that's what Aristophanes is like as well. He says funny things. He has his characters say funny things. But underneath it, there is a great deal, there's a lot of biting, often satire and sarcasm that goes with it. So that even as he is making you laugh, he's making you realize that he's got a point he's making, even as you're laughing. Aristophanes was great at that. He hated Socrates so much, he wrote one whole play about him. It's called The Clowns. Not often performed these days. I have seen it performed once, actually performed in Kansas City about 10 years ago. But it's not performed once too often because it's really about Socrates and who the hell wants to go to theater and see a play about Socrates. I did, of course, but and me and another philosopher were the only ones that went. No, it really wasn't true. I bribed some students to go, saying I'd give them extra. This is back when I was given extra credit. Don't think I do that anymore. But back when I was given extra credit, I'd give extra credit if you went to that thing, play, and wrote, you know, like a 3-page paper about it. So I ended up being able to bribe 4 or 5 people from my class to go. That was pretty good. And what made it even better is that traditionally what happened in ancient Greek plays is that they were performed at 7 in the morning. And this is meant to be very authentic. So it was performed outside in the summer at 7 in the morning on the lawn of the Nelson Atkins there out by Brush Creek. And it was pretty great sitting out there at 7 o'clock, you know, a cup of coffee in your hand, trying to wake up and listen to all this Greek crap happening. It was pretty cool. So the fact I got 4 people to go, I thought was pretty great. How many of you would have done that for extra credit? Well, okay. Oh, you're such bullshitters. Oh, okay. I'm sorry to say terrible things about your character when I don't really know your character. I know Jack's character. You're pretty much disgusting. So, but I think the rest are probably a step up over Jack. So, anyway, I know Jack from the previous class. Okay, it's not you. I'm not just making an assumption about it. So, The Clouds is a biting satire about Socrates, belittling him, making fun of him. It's called The Clouds because Socrates, in most parts of the play, is sort of depicted as inhabiting a cloud, meant to sort of throw light on the fact that he's a philosopher. He never has his feet on the ground. He always has head in the air, head up his ass, one of the two. And so, and also he ran a thinking factory, is what it was. So sort of a thinking factory where sort of people go in, just innocent people, and they come out, thinking morons of some sort. They're just machines, logic machines come out on the other end of the thing. It really is. I like Socrates a lot, but I laugh my ass off at that play. It's a good play. It's done very, very cleverly. Now, why did Aristophanes hate Socrates? He was a nice old roly-poly guy, not Aristophanes. Socrates, he always describes himself in these dialogues, at least Plato allows him to describe himself as sort of the ugliest man in Athens. He didn't shower, nobody showered in those days, just bathed. He didn't bathe. He never washed his tunic, went barefoot everywhere, had 2 bug eyes sort of pointing in opposite directions, and just really, really sort of unattractive sort of a character. And most philosophers are like that, so it works out pretty well. There's something in the books that we read, perhaps. So, who could hate him, and why would anyone hate him? Well, Aristophanes was what today you would call an extreme right-winger. He was an extremely conservative person. Now, what's ironic is Socrates, in his time, was a conservative as well, but he wasn't conservative enough for Aristophanes. Let me describe a little bit of Socrates' conservatism, his political conservatism, because this is sort of a political thing. The dispute between Aristophanes and Socrates is pretty much a political thing. Socrates was conservative in this way. He, first of all, did not trust democracy. He thought democracy was a hoax, that it was the worst idea ever sort of loosed upon civilized world. He occasionally would call it mob rule, nothing more than sort of mob rule with laws. And he just thought it was a terrible thing. And the reason he thought it was a terrible thing came from his philosophical experiences. As he walked around Athens, talking to people in this great democracy that most of the time when he was there in Athens, it was a democracy. He talked to people, tried to find out how well they thought. He was just appalled at how poorly people thought and how absolutely certain they were that they were right, that they were stubborn, dogmatic, and these are the people that vote. These are the people that make up laws. These are the people that run in the country, and they don't know what in the hell they're doing. And so he said, how can we surrender something precious like our great Athens and the way it's supposed to run to this mob? And he was greatly opposed to that. Now, this is not to say that Aristophanes disagreed with me, but Aristophanes' view was that, yeah, the democracy is pretty stupid. What we need to go back is to the old times, the old ways. Tradition is the most important thing. And anybody who upsets tradition, particularly the tradition of obedience without question, these are people who are dangerous. Socrates taught, don't accept authority without questioning. You need to question. Questioning is your way of getting to know things a little better. And I think Socrates probably had surrendered to, in some sense, mentally had decided, I can't stand in the way of the democracy. Democracy is going to be there. People, once people have this, Machiavelli will say this in The Prince, beware when you're trying to take over a country that used to rule itself. Once people have a taste of freedom in their mouths, they never get rid of it. They can never accept anything but freedom. And I think Socrates accepted this view. As much as the Greek democracy was dysfunctional, it wasn't likely to be replaced. And so his philosophical job was to get people to be able to not just take their heads out of their asses on occasion, particularly when they're writing laws and voting for candidates and stuff like that. But because he was asking people to think things through, and when somebody is wielding authority over you and they don't make sense, question them. Don't just let them get away with it. Questioning, rational questioning is the surest way to preserve yourself and preserve a democracy on better terms than just whim. And that's what he thought democracy was, the whim of the many, exercised in a futile way. So he was always suggesting, ask questions. Don't just take some sort of a blow-off answer as the answer. In suggesting people ought to ask questions, Socrates ran afoul of the arch extreme conservative traditionalists to say authority must be obeyed and tradition must be upheld. Everything should go back the way it used to be when the generals ran things. And Socrates didn't think that was any good necessarily, but he thought that you have to have some sort of something other than the helter-skelter whims of an uneducated populace who's running things. Yeah.
Now, was Aristophanes, like, I guess, around when the oligarchs had controlled Athens after the Peloponnesian?
Yeah. And the oligarchs, we'll talk about that when we talk about the trial, because that was an interesting period in the life of Athens. Yeah, he was around. I think he probably, I can't remember, he may have lived longer than Socrates. I haven't checked the end dates for Aristophanes, but he wrote The Cloud somewhere in, I don't know, like 415 or something like that, BCE. Yeah.
And is that what influenced his desire for, non-questioning authority? Was he in favor of the oligarchs, like more of that kind of system?
I would say that Aristophanes would not have been in favor of Spartan oligarchs, oligarchs that favored Sparta. He would have been in favor of good old Athenian oligarchs. Yeah. Let's have strong men beating up in the street, but they got to be from Athens. We can't have strong men from Sparta beating up in the streets. It's okay to have our own people do that. Now, of course, the oligarchs actually were from Athens, but they supported Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. But people sort of began to think of them as being de facto Spartans. And so I think Aristophanes, who saw himself as a patriot, would be in favor of oligarchs from Athens, running Athens with an iron fist. But oligarchs from Athens doing it for Sparta, I don't think so. Better not do that. So they were, and there's really no evidence that Socrates had the same animosity for Aristophanes as Aristophanes had for Socrates. It seemed to be a one-way street of anger and resentment. And Socrates seemed to be a person who, he knew what was happening. He knew he was getting bad mouth all the time. And he just, I guess, tried to keep a low profile on it. So here we have two of the three I want to talk about. We have Plato. He's my hero, says Plato. Aristophanes, he's a dirtbag. So, is there anybody in the middle? Yeah, a historian named Xenophon, spelled with an X. Xenophon was a very good and very well-known historian who was well-known, actually I studied, I think, with Socrates a little bit, but he wasn't the sort of almost the groupie that Plato was. Plato was something like an intellectual groupie to Socrates. Xenophon was a good and well-respected historian. One negative thing about Xenophon was he was nowhere near as good a writer as Plato was. Plato developed a wonderful writing style, a rather graceful way. Might have been more graceful way of writing than actually Socrates ever spoke. We don't know. But Xenophon wrote in a much more sort of a dull way. And so he's really not that well known. People love to read Plato. People will put up with reading, I've read both of them, put up with reading Xenophon. But Xenophon was much more objective, shall we say. He didn't hate, but he didn't worship Socrates. He liked Socrates, but he wasn't going to allow his liking Socrates to interfere with him trying to depict Socrates as objectively as possible. So here we have Xenophon in the middle. With one work, the Apology, the second thing we're going to look at, there's a little confluence of the two. As I said before, Plato places himself at the trial. Everyone seems to agree Plato was at the trial. So his word is pretty good. Xenophon also wrote a depiction of the trial in sort of a similar thing. It's called the Apology of Socrates. And Xenophon wasn't there. In fact, Xenophon was in exile. Xenophon had been kicked out of the country and would eventually come back. They would have sort of had a little bit of an amnesty. He would eventually come back after the trial, after the death of Socrates. But Xenophon wasn't there, but he still wrote a thing there. And what he did, he taught, when he came back, and he talked to people he knew to be at the trial. They gave their view. He didn't, as far as I know, he didn't talk to Plato, but he talked to other people who had been at the trial and took in their information and then wrote his own sort of depiction of what happened at the trial. What makes it interesting is the two are very close. A lot of details are different, but the general structure of what Socrates said, how he was reacted to, sort of the basic contours of the trial are pretty consistent between both Xenophon and Plato, because they sort of are self-reinforcing, because they didn't hate each other, but they sort of traveled different circles. Xenophon was a historian, and Plato was much more interested in being a philosopher and eventually establishing his school, the Academy, in Athens. So here are three different sources of information we have. And I only want to let you know that because we're reading Plato, there are other sources as well. If you wanted to read other sources, that'd be great. There also are people who have written recently about the trial of Socrates, about the death of Socrates, often very, very interesting. I'll name two of them. Robin Waterfield, who is a great historian and does mainly Greek history, now lives in Greece, quite an interesting Englishman. And the other one, now dead sadly, is I.F. Stone. I guess nobody here has ever heard of I.F. Stone. If you've heard of I.F. Stone, my congratulations, you get extra credit, or now you can apply and say you did here. I.F. Stone, I think one of the greatest of all American journalists. He was independent. He didn't work for any network. He didn't work for any newspaper. He published his own newspaper outside of Washington called I.F. Stone's Weekly. And he would write about politics. He would write almost unforgivingly about assholes in power. And he made it a rule that, first of all, no advertisements in his paper. He financed it all himself. And second of all, never take a favor from any politician. Never go to dinner with them, never play golf with them, never send them a Christmas card, nothing like that. Keep yourself distant from the social world of Washington and deal intensely with the political world without favor, without fear, without any way of having it thought that you are either doing someone a favor or crucifying someone unnecessarily. I.F. Stone was, I think, maybe the last great journalist of integrity in the Washington area. And after he finally retired, his I.F. Stone Weekly went down to sort of a bi-weekly, and eventually sort of he retired. And then he was about 80 or so. He retired, and he decided what he would do is learn to read Greek at the age of 80 so that he could read all the documents around Socrates, because he wondered, his view was, why did Socrates have to die? Why did he have to be executed in this trial? Why did this trial go the way it did? And why did everybody, not everybody, but why was Athens so pissed off, or at least why was Athens willing to kill this guy, who was probably one of the most prominent intellectuals ever? Why? And so he spent several years learning Greek, ancient Greek, and then reading the original documents, and then writing a wonderful book called The Death of Socrates. And I've read it a couple times, and he's really not a big fan of Socrates, frankly. He tries to be very objective about, don't just, put this halo around this guy. He was a great guy and a good thinker, but he was not all sweetness and light. And as we talk about the trial, as we go through the difficulties that he had, I'll try to inject a couple of things that I took out of the I.F. Stone book, and also out of the book by Waterfield. It's really a wonderful and much more recent book. Stone's book, I think, came out in the 80s. 80s or early 90s. Waterfield's came out about 3 or 4 years ago. And both good books, both wonderful books, and I like them. So we have some contemporary scholarship still going on about trying to understand who Socrates was and how he came to such a bad end. So I'm not going to force a conclusion on you, but I'm going to try to give you as much information as I can and let you think about Socrates and think about who he was and think about the kinds of things that he stood for, the kinds of ways in which he went about his business in Athens. So I haven't put much on the board by the word Socrates, but I'll do something more than that. What I want to give you are maybe a big pile of 50s and 100s, and you can do with them what you want. But I don't have a big pile of 50s and 100s, so I'll just give you 4 points. 50, 50 and $100 bills. Yeah.
I'll take a $100 bill.
I said I'd like to give you a big pile of 50 and 100s. I didn't say I was going to. I didn't even say I had any. But I am going to Dirty Don's tomorrow. I got to have a 50 so I can buy, what would that be, 200 pounds of apples. I can make a hell of a lot of applesauce with 200 pounds of apples. So I'm looking forward to that. Dirty Don said, oh, those apples are.
What are you going to do with 200 pounds of applesauce? What are you going to do with all that applesauce?
I'm going to bring it in here and sell it to you.
Oh, okay.
I figure, $10 for a thimbleful is about right. This is primo applesauce. So anyway, instead of that, I'm just going to put 4 points on the board about what to look for, how we study, why we study, and the kinds of things that dialogue with Socrates in it have. So let's look at them, or at least I'll write them and maybe you'll. The first is what's often called the Socratic method. One of the reasons we read Euthyphro, it is one of the best examples of the Socratic method in action. It's an easy, 19-page dialogue, fairly simple. It sort of bogs down there in the middle. There's some stuff that becomes difficult, and you can see that Socrates is maybe not doing that well in explaining to Euthyphro what he wants to. But the Socratic method is a method that you see in the dialogues, and it's a method of trying to use questioning to get the other person to provide answers. Now, the problem is you've got to have someone who is willing to talk. You've got to have somebody who thinks they know what they're talking about. This is what Socrates in his trial will say. I went to people, I tried to find out if they knew anything, and everybody seemed to think they know something. He said, okay, tell me about it. Let's talk about it. And they give their ideas, and Socrates asked them questions about the very idea they presented, often questions that are either critical or pointing out some sort of a discrepancy in their reasoning, or pointing out maybe, well, if you hold this true, then you can see this is logically connected to this point of view. You hold that to be true as well, and often the person will say, oh, no, of course not, that's terrible. Well, they're logically connected. If you accept one, you have to accept the other. These are the kinds of things that Socrates would do in sort of working the Socratic method, mainly as a way of working with people who claim they know something to find out what they really know and whether, in fact, they do as well. So the question, why would he do something like that? Well, we'll find out a couple of answers to that when we get into apology, so I'll save that for them. But the argument, well, the thing that Socrates always says is, I don't know anything, I'm dumb. But you know something, because you say you know something, and so you're going to teach me. And this is the way I want you to teach me. I'll ask you questions, you give me answers. I'll look at your answers and say, well, there's something a little fishy here, why don't you change it? And then you change it, and I'll say, oh, there's still something fishy, but it's a different kind of fish. Hootie and the Blowfish, perhaps. And then we go back and forth. And eventually we hope I get to learn something more, learn something that you know, but you have to make certain you're going to teach me. You're going to teach me at a pretty high level, because I'm not going to accept just a bunch of crap. Well, that's sort of his espoused way. That's sort of what he claims he is doing. When in fact what he's really doing is trying to teach them. He's trying to teach them through his cross-examination and through their recognition that they have to look at and think and really question themselves. I mentioned before the view that Socrates taught people to question authority, and that's true. But one thing he taught that is, I think, more subtle and more important is that in order to question authority, you have to first question yourself. And when he went out and started talking to people and trying to engage them in them recognizing that they don't know what they're talking about, that they need to step up their game, not just because they're, hey, Casey, speaking of stepping up your game, I think there's a pillow right over there, put your head on it, you'll be fine. Instead of to step up your game, not because you're talking to Socrates, but because you're dealing with your own life. You have to have a certain high standard of your own knowledge, a certain high standard of what you think. Don't accept crap when you can accept something a little better. So my view, and many people's view as well, is that in suggesting that people, or almost demanding that people question authority, he was also sort of doing it as, but don't forget, you've got to question yourself. In order to, in some sense, in order to know what questions to ask, you've got to first of all know what to ask yourself. And he is there, Socrates, to try to help you with the process of questioning yourself. So that the Socratic method is, at least in some part, a method of self-examination. Socrates would probably say, you can do this yourself, but I'm here to give you sort of the training wheels, the logical training wheels for this process. But eventually you ought to see how it goes, and then do it yourself. And once you're able to do it to yourself, then you ought to be able to fruitfully question those who wish to wield arbitrary power over you, or wish to force laws down your throat that don't make any sense. But you won't be able to do that until you know something more about yourself, until you know something important about who you are and what you are. So the Socratic method is, at least, I would say, mostly about teaching yourself how to understand yourself a little better. There are two things I want to sort of mention about sort of the goals of the Socratic method. And as I said, when we get into apology, where he talks in his defense, he'll talk more about the method and how he went about it and what some of the results were. So here are a couple of goals. A good severe questioning should immunize you from dogmatism. Dogmatism is taking a point of view, refusing to listen to alternatives, refusing to listen to whether there are good reasons for holding that point of view. In other words, being stubborn and pig-headed and not listening to reason. His view is a Socratic method, if you use it and if you are sort of the recipient of it and take it seriously, you can in fact immunize yourself, or you can become immunized from the, he believed, and maybe it was just Athens, maybe it's a human thing. He believed that too many people were willing to slide. Too many people were willing to take it easy intellectually. Too many people were willing to go with what they were taught as kids, or go with what everybody else thinks, or go with what's popular thing. And that would be a kind of dogmatism if you're not willing to listen to reason, if you're only willing to say, well, I'm just going to go with the flow and don't anybody disturb me, please. The do not disturb sign. The do not disturb sign is not something that Socrates feels we ought to honor when it's on someone's mind. That disturbing the mind is always a useful thing, particularly a dogmatic and slumbering mind. So that's one thing the Socratic method can do. But there's a step past that he believes as well. And it's a wonderful Greek, well, this is not a Greek word, this is an English word, it's a translation of it. Flourishing. The bottom line for Socrates was not just to get you think better, but to have you live better. But he believes thinking better leads to living better. That you can't flourish. Flourishing, I do think it's a wonderful word. It's a word that really comes more out of Aristotle, but sort of an ancient Greek concept. That when you are living a full life in every meaningful part of your life, everything of your life, it's not that everything is perfect, but each part of your life that's important and meaningful is positive, and you're getting a lot of good things out of it. That's what flourishing is. His belief is that you can't flourish if you don't know what you're thinking, if you can't substantiate what you think is true, if you can't really know the way the world works, and know the way people work, and know the way you work. You can't flourish. And flourishing is for him, and for many of the Greeks, that's the pinnacle. That's what you're looking for. A life in full, a life of completeness, which is never a perfect life. Always a place where improvement can be done everywhere. But there's nothing so badly neglected that everything is out of balance. So flourishing also means, to a certain extent, a balanced life. Aristotle was very much for a balanced life. And Aristotle is maybe the main philosopher of flourishing, but it's mainly a Greek concept anyway. And his view is, if you can immunize yourself from dogmatism, if you can start thinking for yourself and understanding yourself better, that will inevitably lead to the best possible life, the good life. And that's why he talks about the unexamined life just doesn't get you anywhere. So an examined life means examining it, and using the Socratic method is one of the best ways of examining your life, leading to meaningfulness. That meaningfulness and flourishing come from a life when you look at things squarely, look at things rationally, look at things and be willing to toss aside the old things that you've outgrown and bring in some new things that really more befit your stature. That would be a kind of route to flourishing. So there's a Socratic method. So you find it in nearly every dialogue. And a part of it has to do with him looking for answers, but it's really him trying to get you to find your answers. With the help of some good rational, logical scrutiny, you can find answers. And that's something that he believes all of us need to work on. The second thing you often find in a dialogue is what's called Socratic irony. Now, Socratic irony plays an interesting role in all the works of Plato, because Socrates was there, and but often would say these odd, offhand things that seem to be maybe funny or maybe sarcastic or maybe who knows what. Irony is sort of not much approved, not much, I wouldn't say approved, but not much well practiced today. And irony is just I'll tell you how he uses it, and maybe this will give you an idea. It's a literary device in which you intentionally either place yourself lower, in other words, sort of badmouth yourself, or place someone else higher. And in both cases, the positions you grant are undeserved. That you don't deserve to badmouth yourself, but you do it anyway. This person doesn't deserve to graduate to the higher level, but you do it anyway. And you do it for a particular reason, and the question is, why do it? And there are a couple of different explanations of why Socrates used irony. My favorite one is this. It's one that not as many scholars like, but I'm not as much a scholar, perhaps. I'm just a poor country teacher. And my belief is, first of all, that Socrates had a sense of humor. Socrates liked to laugh. Now, this is pretty consistent with most philosophers I know. When philosophers get together, in fact, there's really a two-philosopher limit on any party. Anytime you have more than two philosophers in any party, it gets a little too rowdy, and the police are summoned, and what can you say? It's really, two philosophers is enough. Keep on the opposite side of the room, please. That'll take care of it. Philosophers are a lot of fun. I'm not a lot of fun, of course, as you can tell. But other philosophers who have a future, who are not retiring or anything like that, they're the ones who have a lot of fun. I think Socrates had fun, too. I think he enjoyed his life. I think he enjoyed this kind of stuff. But I think he often got a little frustrated. I think he got frustrated with the fact that he often ended up having to talk to people who were the intellectual level of tree stumps. And occasionally, I think he just had to say something sort of silly, or say something that maybe only he understood how how strange life can be sometimes. Philosophers, I think, in addition to having a sense of humor, have a very refined sense of the absurd. I don't think you can do philosophy without having a great appreciation for absurdity. And I think Socrates is very much that way as well. So that's my own little private It's not the only thing I think his irony was about. But it is one thing. I think he was just having fun with himself. At no one's expense. No one got hurt with his irony. He was just sort of laughing at sort of almost the futility of trying to convince Euthyphro of anything. And maybe whatever. So I think those things come up. Now, I think there's more to it than that, however. One thing you need to know is that Socrates was famous in his time for being the smartest man in the world. And he always thought that was wrong. He just didn't believe it. He always thought there were people smarter than him, but he could never find any. And this will come up in the trial as well. So think about it. If you're out there, you're in the marketplace, and you're trying to steal apples. You don't have to steal apples, first of all. Go to Dirty Don's. You know, what the hell? They're only 12.5 cents a piece. So, if you got to steal apples, and in ancient Athens, I guess you did. Say you're out there, you're trying to steal apples, but you want to talk to somebody, and Socrates comes along, and Socrates finds out that you know something about the nature of courage. He says, oh yeah, I'm courage. Look, I was in the war, I fought, I killed 1,000 Spartans with my bare hands or something like that, or my pocket knife. And so Socrates was like, yeah, he said, well, I've always wondered about courage. Now, the interesting thing is I shouldn't have chosen courage, because Socrates was a very courageous warrior. He apparently killed all the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. And he was very brave. I mean, there are stories told about how he would permit other people to escape while he was fighting and holding off the people while the retreat was being done. He apparently was an extraordinarily brave and courageous person, not a war hero. War heroes are people that sort of self-promoters, at least maybe not in our day, but certainly in his day. To be a war hero means you sort of had to make certain you told everybody what a great hero you were. He was very modest. People would tell about his exploits, and he would just sort of, I don't want to talk about that. So maybe he wants to talk to this guy about courage, and this guy maybe has been in war a few times. So they start talking about courage, and the guy realizes he's now talking to the smartest man in the world about something, and he starts to dummy up. He says, God, I can't talk to this guy. He's the smartest guy in the world. Socratic irony is a way in which Socrates can get you to open up. Because what he'll say is, now come on, don't take all, I'm not really that. I'm really dumb. I don't know anything. I can't tell you anything about courage, please. You're the authority. You really impressed me with everything. Socrates will put himself down and sort of elevate the other person, mainly as a way to get the other person to talk. The other person is supposed to be the authority, but it can be intimidating to talk to the great Socrates. And so Socratic irony can have really, you might say, maybe a tool, in fact, of the Socratic method. It can go with the Socratic method, and if the Socratic method is not going too well, use a little irony and try to loosen this guy up, and then maybe things will work out. So Socratic irony, I enjoy Socratic irony just because it's funny. And I'll try to point a few examples of it out when we get into Euthyphro. The interesting thing is when we get to Crito, which is almost as long a dialogue as Euthyphro, you'll find almost no irony at all. And the reason for that is Crito is his long-time friend. They have known each other since they were school kids. And he doesn't need to talk Crito into talking with him. They talk as freely and as lovingly as anybody could. And he doesn't want to put this guy down. He doesn't want to make him embarrassed. He doesn't want to joke about the guy. I mean, this is his buddy. This is not the kind of relationships they had. So you won't find much Socratic irony in Crito. You'll find considerably more of it with Euthyphro, who is just sort of an acquaintance, doesn't know anything. In just about every dialogue in which Plato wrote about Socrates, we have one common theme, and that is what I call the search for definitions. And if you started reading Euthyphro already, you'll understand that pretty clearly. That within a few pages, after they say, how you doing, what's happening, how about your trial, oh, leash, then eventually Socrates usually is the one that says, oh, you know something about this, huh? Let's talk about it. But the way Socrates wants to talk about it, he says, if we're going to look at a particular topic, piety, what comes up in Euthyphro, so let's use that. Piety, reverence, sort of religious feeling, respect for what is divine, those kinds of things would be something like what piety is. Yeah?
Really quick, going back to the irony, when he was saying how he should become one time he was a student of the Pro, was that an example of his irony? Like he said, I should just be a student of yours, so I can blame you and not myself for what I've done.
Yeah, except that Socrates wasn't really blaming.
I know, he was like, was that an example of his irony? Where he was
I think Socrates was recognizing that the people he talked to were sort of a low horsepower compared with him. And so occasionally I think he would just sort of get the sense that, well, that's the way things are, huh? And sometimes you get that way. I remember, I love music. I love classical music. I go to concerts and recitals and opera. And I was invited by a friend of mine to a piano recital up in Liberty of the piano teacher of his daughter. He has a daughter he adopted from China, and the piano teacher is an older man from China, and he was going to go back to China to teach in Beijing or someplace like that. And he's having sort of a farewell piano recital. Going to play Beethoven and Chopin, stuff like that. You know, hot stuff. I said, great, I'll go. You bet. And it was going to be free. And there's going to be food afterwards. I mean, Chinese food at that. I mean, this is a win-win situation. I get to hear great music, and I get to eat, and I get to schmooze with some people that I like a whole lot. So I go and sit in, we come down, everybody applauds, we sit down. First 10 seconds I knew this is going to be a long bleeping afternoon. This guy couldn't play chopsticks competently. And either he knew it or he didn't know it, but he just played the sloppiest, awfulest, most nasty, putrid Dirty Don's recital I have ever heard. And, but that's the sort of thing where you say, I was expecting competence, I didn't even get that. But, you know, I'm not going to embarrass my friends, I'm not going to embarrass them, I'm not going to embarrass Beethoven and Chopin by, you know, doing what I want to do, which is shout up and curse and shake my fist at the guy. So I just sat there and said, okay, well, that's the way the afternoon's going to be, I'll be okay with it. That's sort of a Stoic point of view. The Stoicism is a philosophical point of view that came out of ancient Greece. So I think that's what Socrates was. In fact, Socrates is often considered by the Stoic philosophers that followed him to be sort of an early wannabe Stoic, where sometimes you just have to say, that's the way it's going to be. I can't do anything about it. I'm not going to get my shorts in an uproar. And I think sometimes when he was talking to people that he realized that I'm not going to get much out of these people. This is just not going to be a good time. That he may just have sort of, you know, laughed at himself more than anything else, or laughed at fate, or laughed at, this is the circumstance I'm in, I'll make the most of it, and we'll see what happens. At least I got some good wine at home, and so I can have something like that. And by the way, you also had a young wife at home, so you know, there can be a lot of compensations there. Yeah, his wife was, I think, half his age. And she had children, actually it wasn't until, I think they married late. He was, I guess, in his 50s when he married Xanthippe, who was, I guess, in her 20s. And then they had they had 3 children, 3 boys, when he was, you know, late 50s, early 60s. Because most of the kids were, the kids were still alive and at home when he had his trial. So he had a few comforts, I suppose. So good for him. So the search for definition, however, to get back to that, is a search for, here we're going to choose this concept. You happen to know about piety, for instance. I said, okay, you know about piety. Tell me, what's piety? For Socrates, you can't discuss something until you sort of get on the same page as what the concept means. Once you get a knowledge of the concept means, then you'll know how to apply it. And it eventually would come down to application. Socrates always wants to know, once we figure out what this concept is, how can we apply it? In the case of piety, he and Euthyphro are both going to go to trial and probably want to use their knowledge of piety in a way that will affect the jury, a way that will affect the trial in a positive way. And so, for his view is, though, you got to know what the concept means. Get it so it's right, and airtight, logically good, and then we'll see how to apply it. So the search for definition is, in a sense, the search for, okay, here's what we're going to be looking at. Let's see if we can find a definition, or let's say a description of the concept that will stand up. And that's what happens in nearly every trial. I mean, every dialogue. You go to something like the Republic, the great work of about 300 pages, there's still 300 pages about the search for justice. What does it mean to be just? What is justice? And how to create a just state, that kind of thing. So that every dialogue is going to have within it the search for the definition of some important term, not some trivial term, or else Socrates probably wouldn't be interested in it, but some important term that has to do with human life, that has to do with the human experience. For him, piety was an important person, an important thing. He was very religious. He was a religious person, and so piety was a part of his life, but he wanted to make certain he got it right. And then we go to other things. If you read the Symposium, or one of the great works, sort of a later work of Plato, you read the Symposium, it's all about love. You read Theaetetus, it's all about knowledge. Just about everything has a particular concept that they're trying to define. And that's sort of the core, the main theme of the dialogue. The fourth and final one of these applies only to the dialogue Euthyphro. And I'm going to call it the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro dilemma or Euthyphro problem, whatever you want to call it. It is really the one part of this dialogue. It's a short dialogue, so it wouldn't have a whole lot of, say, philosophical substance if it weren't for this. I mean, you get these other things in it. This is good. I mean, you get these kinds of things, the first three, in Euthyphro. You get them beautifully. But you also get one extra thing, a little focus. There's a problem, a dilemma that comes up about halfway through, a little before halfway through the dialogue, where they're talking back and forth, and Euthyphro, after being prodded by Socrates, gives a refinement of a previous definition. And Socrates says, okay, that's pretty nice. Let's see, what about, and he asked this question. He asked this wonderful question. I'll save it for when we get there, because I think it's wonderful as it sort of evolves out of Socrates saying, well, what about this? And he asked a question, what we'll call a causal question, about what causes what. Cause and effect. Cause leads to effect. What he is going to be asked is this the cause or is this the effect? And it becomes a rather difficult question. It becomes a rather interesting question. And the dilemma that it has produced has outlived the dialogue. The dialogue itself is very nice. But people extract the Euthyphro dilemma and talk about it. And it has really become, it's still a dilemma. I mean, 2,500 years later, we think about the kinds of things that were brought up out of this conversation. And we say, you know, there's really still not a solution to this. Now, that's pretty great because it's a central core issue for most people. And yet, it's an issue that we can't resolve. And yet, there seems to be no escape route for this either. So it's a very, very difficult thing. And I'll let you discover it when you discover it because I think it's more fun for it to come out then. But that's something that only comes out of Euthyphro. And it's other dialogues do have these wonderful moments in which you get something special out of them. And those are nice. I mean, with Crito, we have this wonderful moment where, for lack of a better word for it, Socrates becomes a ventriloquist. So you'll like that. I'll bring in my ventriloquism book and you can all attempt to throw your voice somewhere or not. So that's, well, that's okay. Any question on this stuff? So it hasn't been much. You haven't had to do much writing. If this is your first time here, are you the only one? By the way, if you came in late, come and see me. I have a hickory stick, or let me know who you are so I can put your name down. Don't call you completely absent, just sort of partially absent. I guess only you haven't read the syllabus yet, so make sure you read the syllabus. You're getting.
The syllabus is online, isn't it?
Yeah. But so you've read it, you've memorized it.
I've memorized it now. I could if you want me to.
You don't have to. But if you read it and you understand it, we're okay.
Then you said something about the videos online. I needed to watch those, but they didn't close till like February, so I didn't write.
Yeah, the ones that are up now will close February 3rd, which is a Sunday night. So you got until then to watch them and then talk and
Comment on the discussion board.
You'll be okay with that. But there will be a continuing stream of videos that will come in. It'll be endless. You know, when the semester comes over, you just collapse into a heap. So, Okay, anything at all? If not, I guess you've got a weekend to look forward to. I've got a whole lot of applesauce to make.